Education Network, along with Melanie Molinoff. I just want to say a few words, and then I plan to shut up for the rest of the evening. Because this is meant to be a community conversation with candidates for the Ward 3 representative for the State School Board of Education. We're very, very happy to have Jenny Abamu, who's the education reporter for WAMU. And we're, of course, also very happy to have our two candidates, Dora Correa and Ruth Wattenberg. So the format for this evening is going to be some opening remarks of 3 minutes each from each of the candidates. And then we want to hear from you. We want to hear your questions. And each candidate will have 2 minutes with which to answer the questions you ask. And then we'll have some concluding remarks again of 3 minutes. All right. And with that, I'll turn it over.
And forgive me if I interrupt a candidate. I try to keep it fair so that everyone does actually get 2 minutes and not longer or shorter. So if you go over, I will have to interrupt a little bit.
Do we get any warnings?
For the 2 minutes, it might be more annoying if I warned you throughout that process each time. So just try and keep your answers concise, I would say. And generally, for those who don't know, I assume most people know, but for those who don't know, the State Board of Education, they've changed a lot throughout the years in DC. 2007, they had a lot more power. Of course, now in 2000, after the mayor took over schools in 2007, now the State Board of Education mainly advises the state superintendent as far as things like state standards, policies related to those standards. So a lot of different issues as far as kind of looking at, for example, ESSA or the different school board, state school board initiatives and things like that. They can do credit recovery. They can say, okay, what do the policies look like there? They can kind of look at those policies, approve those policies, disapprove those policies. And they've also done some other things like right now they've commissioned a report to look at teacher turnover rates in the city. So the state school board has done different things in the city. Things can change. There is currently a bill in DC that could allow the state school board, if passed, to begin to have this control over the state superintendent. So just know that those things can happen, things can change throughout the school year. So just keep that in mind as you're voting, know who you're voting for, what you're voting for. And so just so we can begin, I will start with a few questions just to get us rolling, and then we can move into the questions from the audience, okay? So first question, now keep it very general. What is one of the biggest issues? Oh, go ahead.
I said I should have, but we would start with the opening remarks.
Oh, yes, sorry. My apologies.
Very enthusiastic.
I know, it's very going. Okay, Ruth, you actually go first. 3 minutes.
So let me just say I am so happy to be with all of you. I know so many faces. We have done so much work together, and I'm really excited to be here and be able to talk about what we've been doing in the last 4 years and what is left to do. I am especially happy to be literally right here. Our kids went to Janney right next door. Then they went to Wilson right across the street, and they went to Deal right across the park. And my niece went to Hearst just down the street and has now followed her cousins to Deal. So it really is great to be here. So for those reasons, I feel like I know our schools. But since being elected, I've been to every school in the ward multiple times. I've met with LSATs, I've met with PTOs, I've met with HSAs, I've met parents at back to school nights and at fall fairs. I know our schools in this ward very well. I know their many strengths, and I know the challenges that they face. I'm not going to talk much about the strengths because we know them, beginning with effective principals, strong faculties, and supportive families. But we also have challenges here. Overcrowding, funding that is unpredictable and non-transparent, top-down mandates that make our schools use staff and scarce dollars the way the central office says, not the way the schools think makes sense. Sometimes we have excessive test prep, and sometimes that squeezes out science, social studies, civics to make room for the tested subjects of math and reading. I make it my business to advocate for Ward 3 funding, for Ward 3 families. We've turned around the funding at Wilson. We prevented the surplusing of Old Hardy and the closure of Fillmore. We have some other work that's going to be coming forward soon from the community working group on overcrowding. But in the long run on overcrowding, We have to improve our neighborhood feeder systems across the city. When families around the city can't count on their kids getting a good education in their neighborhood schools, they leave the city, or more and more, they move to Ward 3. Every issue except crowding is much worse elsewhere in the city. Any issue that is a relatively mild problem here, the budget, teacher turnover, inadequate mental health services, here it's like a cold, but elsewhere in the city it's a flu, and in some parts of the city it's pneumonia. Raising the importance of these issues and the low achievement that they cause is an important role of the State Board. Solving problems, whether they're overcrowding or the achievement gap, is doubly hard because accurate data and research are so hard to come by. We know that our high school graduation data was inflated from the media, actually from Jenny's predecessor, from Kate McGee. That's why we know, and we just learned now from City Paper, again the media, that key data that's necessary for figuring out the master facilities plan is being kept from the people doing the work. So I've been active and effective. I'm eager to continue this work. It's because of this work that I've been endorsed by, and I'm very excited to say this, by PTA leaders at every Ward 3 secondary school at Wilson, Deal, and Hardy. Okay. So thanks, I look forward to talking to you.
Great, all right, Dora?
Thank you to the Ward 3 Wilson Education Network for organizing this forum. And thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Dora Correa, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and tell you about what I think are the top priorities for the State Board of Education. I have devoted my career in international development to promoting and enhancing the opportunities for people who didn't have them. I figure that no society can afford to leave large portions of its population untapped. That was not the case for me, because thanks to my parents who left my home country, thanks to teachers who guided them, I got an absolutely excellent education, and I feel everyone is entitled to that opportunity. I later became a Spanish teacher. I worked in a Title I public high school, so I know firsthand the challenges of teaching in low-income, underserved communities. And I see in here 3 top priorities. My top priority is planning for the growth in public enrollment. I think when we see the numbers, when we hear numbers like the 10,000 or 15 or 17,000 additional students that the district will need to accommodate by 2028, I think we have to get really serious. And I think that this planning is an opportunity to deal with long-standing issues. On one hand, to deal with the overcrowding issues in Ward 3, but also to deal with the achievement gap, because we all know that these challenges are related. Every parent wants their kid to go to the best schools, and so we crowd around the best schools. Second, I think that we need to rebuild the confidence in DCPS. I think we need to push back on the micromanagement. We need to give our proven school leaders the ability to move resources, the greater budget flexibility. They have tight budgets as it is, and therefore they should be able to maximize the use of those resources. And finally, I think we need to recommit to DC students. We need to meet the adequacy standards of a per pupil funding formula, and we need to set out a kind of planning process that joins the different exercises that the city has been involved in, whether it's the ESA targets, the school report card, and the master facilities plan. They need to be brought together into an education plan, into a unified sector plan that sets out what the policy priorities are as we meet this growth. So, bottom line, the DC economy and the budget are strong. New leaders in the sector promise a fresh start. So I think with this plan, with this growth that we are facing, we have a unique opportunity to really address issues from the past.
Okay. So thank you both for your opening statements. I think both of you, as you all think of questions, just feel free to start raising your hands, and so we can start to go into the questions. And so I'll just start by leading, since you all both kind of touched on this a little bit. What is your #1 priority when you take your seat at the State Board of Education? Ruth.
Well, let me say, on the State Board of Ed, I think of it having a couple of different buckets, and I have priorities in each bucket. On the State Board of Ed, as one of 9 people on the board, we have some policy areas that we can deal with, such as the school report card, which I hope we'll talk about more. I think fixing that is a huge priority. I also think on the state board, part of what's really important is using that bully pulpit to raise important issues. And so we have just put out this report on teacher turnover, which, by the way, it's data that has not been published. It has not been transparent in DC. It's really kind of outrageous, and the state board has just published it. So I want to continue doing that kind of stuff. And then locally here in Ward 3, the issue of school crowding is a terrific problem. And so I've really been on top of it and want to continue to do that.
Ruth, you still have a little bit of time, so I'm just going to ask you a little bit about the overcrowding part, because you mentioned that earlier. Can you elaborate a little bit on what you think, what can you do to kind of alleviate that problem?
Well, let me say, part of it has to do with the planning that Dora raised. I'll just say that as a parent with kids at Janney, Deal, and Wilson, and I'm looking around and I see people sort of from my cohort, every time my kid went to one of those schools, it was overcrowded. They renovated it, they expanded it, and the day they went to school there, it was overcrowded. So this is a problem. We do, and I see this is a problem that is getting worse. Finally, this year, one thing that has happened that had never happened before is DCPS has actually acknowledged that this is a problem and that it's not going to go away. For a long time, they said it's a pig in the python, and these kids are going to grow up and they're going to go away and nobody else is going to be here. And I think finally, after a lot of advocacy and a lot of involvement by people here, we're at a point where they understand this is not going away and we need to talk seriously about it. So there's now some ideas that are beginning to roll out. We can talk about them.
And Dora, same question for you. What's your number 1 priority? I think you mentioned overcrowding, so if that is your number 1 priority, what would you do about it?
My number 1 priority is planning for growth. And I think that in planning for growth, you have a certain advantage in terms of having a broader view of what's happening in the city. I think as Ruth mentioned before, it was just sort of a focus, it's Ward 3's problem. But now when we look at the numbers, we can no longer say that that's the case. In fact, it is a more generalized problem. And we need to have a bigger view, a district-wide view of looking at it. And I think that district-wide view, that beginning to have transparent, and at least I think that we're moving towards a consensus on the numbers, on what the big numbers look like, that gives us an opportunity to look at overcrowding in Ward 3, but also overcrowding in other areas, to figure out sort of what are our options in order to make excellent education available. But also the other thing I mentioned is the achievement gap. I think that those two go together. We're overcrowding on one hand, and then looking at how it is that we can increase the quality of education in all wards.
And just kind of looking at, you haven't said exactly on the achievement gap, how are those two things connected? Just for people who might not make that connection naturally.
Well, the achievement gap, the way that I see it, it is that many wards do not have enough good quality schools available. And so when that happens, what happens is that, like any parent wants the best education for their child, so they will go in search of that best education, and they will come, as Ruth has pointed out, they will come to Ward 3, because Ward 3 is known for having some of the best schools. So that's where I see the connection between the overcrowding on one hand and the achievement gap on the other. And I think the district-wide formula, this planning for the future, I think it gives us an opportunity.
Does anybody in the audience have a question particularly about this?
Yeah.
Introduce yourself and so that
I'm Jill Sanderson from Stoddard Elementary, which is 145% overcrowded this year. So I just, there have been lots of committees, meetings, etc. over the last year about overcrowding, but what we're really lacking is a few viable ideas that we can make into a reality. So I want to know what you two have heard that you think is actually a viable solution to overcrowding.
Who wants to go first? Dora, go ahead.
Okay. I think that the group that looked at overcrowding in the context of Ward 3, I identified a series of broad actions, sort of categories, perhaps buckets, we might call them buckets of options, in order to deal with the overcrowding. Some of them, I think, are I would add another set of options, or another kind of option, which is a short-term option and a longer-term option. And we're all looking, I think, at this longer-term option, but what is it that we can do in the long run? Things like, for example, even where there are talk about impact fees, about evening out, trying to maximize the spaces that are currently under district control, doing a full inventory to identify spaces, to see what could be leased, what could be used. So there's a number of these things. I think that that's an important part, because again, we're looking at a broader set of possibilities, if you will. But I do think that now, as the overcrowding and as the potential overcrowding issue covers a broader area and not just fourth grade, now I believe that more people are going to be more interested, and it is in everybody's interest to try and cooperate to see how it is that we can figure out what combination of those different options and those different buckets will work better on the district-wide level, but obviously, with each ward looking after their own convenience as well.
So let me say, just to be clear on this, so there's a number of reports coming out about the enrollment growth in DC and in DCPS. And the growth that Dora's talking about, that we're going to grow 10, 15,000 students, that is over 5 years, 10 years, I think even 15 or 20 years. The growth in Ward 3 is right now. Elsewhere in the city, we were just at a meeting, elsewhere in the city, in most wards, schools are under capacity, not over capacity. So for the short run, even the medium run really, it really is a Ward 3 issue that has to be dealt with. And the Community Working Group, which is this group that has been working for about a year and a half to try to come up with some solutions, it came up with a good set of ideas. For example, early childhood centers. If we could, one problem, it's a problem at Stoddard, it's a problem at Key, it's a problem at Janney, it will soon be a problem at Murch. The schools can't offer 4-year-old pre-K because there's not enough classrooms. So one way we could handle this is we could set up some early childhood centers, which don't have to be as big as, for example, as a whole elementary school, but then they could handle the pre-K, and they could also siphon off some of the kindergarten, some of the first grades even, so that you would alleviate the crowding at the existing elementary schools, and you'd make possible the broader pre-K. So that's a great idea. Another idea that's been talked about is we need another high school. Wilson now has 1,800 kids, and it has already stopped taking out-of-bounds kids. Right now, you've got some out-of-bounds kids that are still coming up the pipeline, but once they're not coming up the pipeline because the elementary schools can't bring in more out-of-bounds kids, there's going to be fewer and fewer out-of-bounds kids at Wilson. And I don't think anybody wants to see Wilson be an entirely white high school, or an 80 or 90% white high school, and that is in the cards if we don't do something about it. So one thing that can be done, people have talked about, is there should be another high school. One option that has been talked about is at Ellington, as people, all right, let me just kind of finish this one sentence. At Ellington, as some people may know, they only use half of the building at any given time. So one idea is you could have a 400 or 500 person high school, a small high school, that used that space when the Ellington students weren't using it. So there's a number of good ideas. The question is now getting together and getting the mayor and the council to put the money in it and deal with it.
Any other questions particularly about school crowding? Yes.
Yeah.
Please introduce yourself.
I'm sorry, Glenn Wesley, former Horace Mann and Deal parent. And that's as far as we got. Yeah. One of the reasons I voted for Muriel Bowser in the last election was that she talked a lot about, well, we've got Alice Deal, and that's solid. We need about 4 more of these scattered around the city, and that sounded good. There's a lot of good elementary schools, junior high's the next thing, and then high school after that. Did anything ever happen with that? Is that the first step we need to take, is the junior highs, or is it the high school? Where do we begin this?
I think we didn't get very far on that.
Yeah.
In fact, the middle schools is the place in the city, and in DCPS where the numbers go down a lot. They have, I think, the most surplus space, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But one thing I want to talk about is there's a tendency often around high schools to say, we got to fix our high schools, we got to fix our high schools. And to some extent, we got to fix our middle schools, we got to fix our middle schools. And we do. But in parts of the city, kids are graduating, are coming out of the elementary schools with 10%, 12%, 8%, 15% of the kids proficient in reading and math. And if that's the case, you're not going to have a successful middle school. You're just not going to. And so we really have to double down and also be talking about our elementary schools. We have to be talking about reading. There's a whole bunch of, there's a new report out that's on NPR, I think, that people should get a hold of about, we know so much about early reading. We know how to do it for almost every student, and yet it's not happening. Why isn't it happening? Is it happening here? I suspect it's not. We need to really understand why not. We need to be in these schools with research, understanding, is it happening, is it not happening, and why not, so we can solve it.
Dora, do you have a response?
I think on the, as we look to the future, there will be cohorts that will be growing and that will be looking at different stages. So the elementary, and then the middle, and then the high school. And I think that one of the things that we need to be looking at is we need to be looking at how it is that we can design school facilities so that we can be a lot more flexible in terms of their use. So I think while I would say that yes, indeed, size is important to be able to give programmatic, different programs, different options, I also think that we need to be looking at new ways of designing schools so that we can have greater flexibility, because the population will ebb and flow, and so we will need to adjust to those population streams. The other thing I think we need to do is we need to be a lot more conscious about the trajectory of students throughout their careers and have a view as to how it is that they move in different programs. For example, if you are, we see parents today that one of the great demands that we see is for dual immersion programs. So that we also need to figure out how is it that we start that out in pre-K and then move throughout the system, because we want to make sure that we can give the supports to parents to see that full trajectory as students move from pre-K all the way to high school. So there's a programmatic issue, I think, as well, particularly in these areas of demand like dual language programs.
10 seconds, but to this question, would that be focused first on elementary, middle school, high school?
I think that you have to what we see now is we see a tremendous demand in pre-K. And so what you have to do is you have to try to figure out this demand. And I think part of the issues that Ruth spoke to on how it is that one has more flexibility in responding to the increased demand in pre-K is one thing you can do. But I would add that layer of the dual language immersion and then how that moves throughout the system, because you really do want bicultural, bilingual students at the end, or at least many parents do.
Hi.
Sorry,
Which one?
Then you.
Okay.
Introduce
Bancroft.
yourself.
Hi, Libby Buckley, Bancroft parent. My kids were a product of Ward 1 schools, not Bancroft previous to that. Having been now in the school system for about 10 years, the first big, I've seen a lot of the reforms come and go. And one of the big hopes when my kids started school was that having free preschool for 3 and 4 year olds would vastly improve reading and learning scores further down the line. My kids are now 13. I can tell you that the kids that they started with who were living in extreme poverty are not showing the benefits of that early childhood education being paid for in DC public schools. I feel like there tends to be more and more initiatives coming up and going, and nobody's dealing with the underlying issue, which to me is the extreme poverty and underlying inequalities in our city. So what stance are you guys taking on that, and how do you see taking a stance on a school board that would incorporate advocating for more appropriate wages and a better life for our poorest residents? That's for both candidates.
Yeah, if you want, I'll just
Go ahead.
when I spoke of the achievement gap, I spoke of communities that have issues that go beyond just education. And I think we've tried several ways of getting at that. We've looked at, for example, whether you call it wraparound services or whether you call it a whole child approach, community schools, how it is that we attend to the needs of children that go beyond education. So some of the things like health issues, how is it that we help their parents? How is it that we sometimes take schools and we have a school, the regular school in the morning, and then all of a sudden the school can become a place where parents can come and also get language instruction or get instruction on how it is that to take care of their children, what kind of choices children have in the school system. So I think that there are a whole variety of things that go beyond education that have to be brought to bear on this issue. That's why I would say that there's no way that just education policy alone can solve these issues. There's also housing policy. As you will mention, housing policy, bringing more people. It's not enough to just bring people in to communities and to give them an opportunity to the best schools. I think we also need greater mix within our neighborhoods, greater income mix within our neighborhoods. So I think there's a whole variety of policies that can be brought to bear to improve the life of those who have had the least opportunity and those who are the most vulnerable.
Ruth?
Yeah, so first of all, I totally agree. You cannot close the achievement gap if you don't deal with poverty. It's absolutely the case. Anybody who's involved in education policy and has been through all the reforms that you're talking about knows that to be the case. I have done some work with the council and sort of tried to lend my voice at the council to sort of make that point. And there was a big push to around some sort of after hours childcare around that. So I think we can do stuff by raising our voices at the council and making it clear to the council that education people believe dealing with poverty is really important. I also think that there is stuff that we can surface in the education field that begin to deal with it. So one is the community schools idea that Dora was talking about. And one thing I would encourage you to read, so this is, last summer I worked with my colleague from Ward 8 and we put together what ended up being this lead article in City Paper. Yay, City Paper. But it's called Memo to the Chancellor, and it really is a lot about how the issues in the two wards, strangely enough, are similar. As I say, for us, they're mild issues, teacher turnover and so on. And in Ward 8, they're really pneumonia. But we lay out a lot of things that need to be done, and one of them is the community schools. And actually, since then, Marcus and I have both been on a trip to Baltimore with a bunch of DCPS leaders to try to look and see what they're doing in Baltimore, try to learn from that. And I'm on a task force with DCPS and a whole bunch of community people to sort of vet and develop some ideas. And that report has happened, and it's my understanding that I believe this year is a planning year for maybe 10 additional community schools. There was a set of 10, and now this is an expansion of them. But I also want, and I think it's a great idea, and I'm very hopeful about it, but I want to go back to something else you said about the early childhood and about this, which is if all you do is throw a program out there, I don't care if it's early childhood or if it is community schools, if you don't check to see if it's working, it's about implementation. You need to check, check, check. That is why you need independent research, which I've raised, I'll raise it again, because if all we do is tell ourselves everything's working, it doesn't get better.
And you had a question?
Yeah, I'm Kate Johnson. I'm the director of St. Paul's Nursery School, and I piggyback what you say totally. And also, I wish the city would work together so that the school board works with the city council, works with the mayor, works with us, and talks to the teachers and to the schools out there, because this is not happening. You know, when Vincent Gray's got a bill, it passed, where he wants infants through all the way up in the public schools. And, you know, when you put in the pre-K-4s, all of our schools used to have 4-year-old programs, and then we gave them up because we can't compete with free. And now you're all crowded, so now you don't have us you know, to fall back on. And with all this infants all the way up, we're losing families who are going out of the ward and wanting to get places in DuPont Circle or wherever there are places, and they're taking them. And also, you know, we're losing teachers to the public schools because we can't compete with the benefits and the costs. But you have these fabulous preschools in this award, and none of us, well, we're full, but hardly any of the other schools are full this year. And yet you guys are overcrowded, so I don't know why. I think we should work together. And
Okay,
you
so your
should-
question is, how can you all work, how can they work together?
Yeah, with the city council, the mayor, and the teachers and the schools that you already have.
All right, Ruth?
And then you have Aussie, who's just runs us.
Yeah, well, that's actually what I wanted to pick up on. I've had conversations with Kate about this. Part of the problem is the early childhood policy is determined totally in Aussie. And Aussie, it's a state education agency. It's not designed to have interaction with people in the city. It doesn't, on those issues, it doesn't have any interaction with us on the State Board of Ed. And it feels completely within its rights to do whatever it wants.
Yeah.
And even the council has had problems trying to deal with that. So that's a problem. And when people talk about governance issues, that's an issue that has to be dealt with. How can you have sort of an office that's so large that deals with such important things, and there's no real give and take?
Well, and nobody's over there. I mean, nobody holds them.
So Ruth, how would there be a way to, you have more time, so would there be a way to, I don't know, improve communication in that space with different
Well,
entities?
here's part of the problem. You can improve communication, but if the agency that has all the authority doesn't want to communicate, that's a problem. And that's the problem, I would say, that really needs to be solved.
All right, Dora?
Okay. Aussie is an oversight agency, and it has these mix of functions. It does, it manages federal funds. It also does what Ruth just mentioned in terms of the early childhood. So it's a bit of a mix of functions, but it does respond to the mayor. And like all other agencies, they respond to the mayor. And so I think one of our issues as voters is that we need to hold our elected leaders accountable. We need to ensure that the council is holding the elected leaders accountable, because it is the job of the council, in fact, to counterbalance the executive. So I think that we have the elements in order to be able to have greater response by Aussie. Perhaps Aussie needs to be strengthened in certain areas, perhaps its functions needs to be defined more so that its compliance function and its auditing function are separate from a more service-oriented function. But they do, I think they, right now, the Aussie is controlled by the mayor, and the city council is a check on the mayor, and the voters are a check on the mayor.
But that isn't what happens. You know, and the mayor doesn't respond to us, and nobody runs against the mayor, so. Nobody runs against the mayor, Bessie should already against the mayor.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Eunice Greer. Full disclosure, I work for the U.S. Department of Education. I do not speak for the U.S. Department of Education.
In the evening.
Right. So if you look at the NAEP scores, National Assessment of Educational Progress, if you look at the aggregate scores, Washington, D.C. is near the bottom. If you disaggregate the data by ethnicity and you look at the white scores, those kids are almost near the very top of the distribution. We have a horrible problem. It is not going to be fixed if we start at middle school or high school. We have got to start with babies, because vocabulary really is critical. I think most of the people in this room know the research on vocabulary. That's probably why they're here. I will not give you a lecture. What about year-round schools? What about year-round schools where these kids need it the most, where they need to talk? They don't need to sit and listen, they need to talk. They need people talking to them. They need to grow these vocabularies so that when they come into the classrooms, they're ready to learn. Because the rich get richer and the poor get poorer when you're talking about vocabulary. So how do we start at the beginning, and has anybody thought about year-round schools?
All right, I'll let you start this one.
I have not heard, I haven't been in the State Board of Education, but I have not heard of a discussion on year-round schools. I've heard it in the national context, certainly, about year-round schools and also about schools that, cover the day, the working day, in order to have a longer school day that will make it also easier on parents. But as far as a year-round day, I have not heard of any discussions. And given, I think, the issues of overcrowding, I don't know if that is indeed a possibility. I've not heard about that.
Of course, the overcrowding isn't in those schools, so in that sense, it could be looked at. The DCPS has looked at extended year, although it hasn't looked at all year. And I think that part of it is the results on the extended year are sort of mixed. And again, I just want to go back to this. Why is that, right? It should be a good idea. What's happening? We don't know in these schools.
Put a better program in place. If you do the same thing for 12 months that you've done for 9 months, you're going to get
Exactly. And so we need to understand what's going on in the extended year so we can determine whether it could work year round. So I think that's something that could happen. But I want to go back to the early childhood piece and the babies piece, because I'm totally with you on the vocabulary issue. This is actually what I cut my teeth on when I was the Educational Issues Director at the American Federation of Teachers. My biggest thing that I was interested in and that I really pursued was this issue of background knowledge, vocabulary, because that's what gives kids the ability to be strong reading comprehenders. And I want to say two things on that. One, we have this early childhood program. Most our low-income 3-year-olds all have the right to be in a early childhood program. And you probably know this better than me if you're at the Department of Ed and looking at this. Some programs where you have 3- and 4-year-olds in early childhood, in pre-K, the differences are very substantial. And then in some places, they're not. It matters whether you do it well. And that's what we really need to be looking at. And it is the place where we could be doing the vocabulary and the language. And whenever I see reports about our early childhood programs, it's always things like, we have the most square footage for kids, and all of our teachers have BAs or AAs, and it's a bunch of quantitative issues that we're the best in. And you can look at these reports that always come out, we're the best. But nobody's looking at the content of what's going on in the classroom. So I think it's super important.
Other questions? Yes, please introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Nick Keenan. I'm a former Key School parent. My question is about neighborhood schools. DC is, for a long time, has had some form of school choice, but about 15 years ago, they really got into school choice in a serious way with the advent of charter schools and sort of formalization of the out-of-boundary system. And one of the results of that has been that we really no longer have a neighborhood school system in most of the city. That roughly 3/4 of the kids in public school in DC don't go to neighborhood schools. And so I have kind of a 3-part question about that. One is, is a neighborhood school system good? Is that something that we should be trying to get to? Is it possible? Have we gone too far down the road of school choice to go back to the neighborhood-based school system? And if it is possible, how do we get there?
Ruth, I'll let you start.
So let me start with your first question, is a neighborhood school system good? And what I would say is pretty much any family, for most of their kids, most of the time, if you give them a choice of a high-quality neighborhood school or anything else, they're going to pick the high-quality neighborhood school. And all you have to do is come to Ward 3, and that's what you see. When people have that option, that's what they choose. They don't send their kids to charters. Interestingly, there was just a report that came out from the auditor's office where this was actually a report that came as a result of Councilwoman Shays saying we need to have a real study around enrollment issues. And it came out. and they asked a question all across the city, whether people would prefer to have more charters or whether people would prefer to build up the neighborhood schools. And by 2 to 1, people wanted the build up of the neighborhood schools. I think it was 63 to 32, if I'm remembering right. That's what people want. So have we gone too far to get there? No, I mean, I don't think so. But we have to have rules in place that allow people to make these choices. There's, actually, I think it was you that one time, what is that? The theory about when everybody wants...
Tragedy of the Commons.
The tragedy of the commons, thank you, Nick. The tragedy of the commons, where every individual would rather be in a high-quality neighborhood school. But when you don't give them exactly that choice, they all make these decisions that leads everyone to go to charter schools. And in the end, as a society, we have what people don't want. So we have, and part of that is driven by, we don't have a set of rules that allow people to make the decisions that would lead us to where we want to be.
Dora?
I think that's a great place to pick it up, the rules. Because I agree also with Ruth that when there are lots of benefits to neighborhood schools, transportation not being, reducing commuting times not being the least of them. Right now, it would seem that we do not have a way that is of planning that allows us to deploy both traditional public schools, neighborhood schools, and charters. And I think that as we look into the future and some of the things that have been, some of the exercises that have taken place, for example, the school report card that begins to look and have comparable metrics with for both traditional public schools and charter schools, that is beginning to put them in the same rules space. I think that that's a step ahead. So I think that we need to figure out how it is that we can maximize the benefits to our students by using these different instruments. And maybe we use them in different ways, but we need to figure out how it is that we can have rules in place that evaluates the benefits of each. I think that if you talk to, depending on what the parents that you talk to in the neighborhood, of course they would love neighborhood schools, but I think also some parents would like, also I've heard a lot of parents who want choices in terms of certain programmatic availabilities. So I think that we need to keep some options open, programmatic options open, but I think we need to have a set of rules that allow us to compare and allow parents to compare and then be able to make choices based upon good information.
Could we do another round on that? Go back and forth, or do you want to?
All right, let me see if anyone else has questions, and I'll try and come back to them. Okay. Yes, in the back.
John McHugh, I'm Janny Deal, Wilson parent. I have two questions. One is about the governance topic you touched on before, is vis-a-vis the charter schools, where part of the system you have a lot of influence over, part of the system you have very little influence over, being the charter system. Would either one of you support reconfiguring the governance system as it stands today, so it's not so centered on the mayor and has more input from, say, us, the parents and the educators and the other people, say, Board of Education? It's one of the few systems that has this much power vested in one individual, being the mayor. That's first question. And the second question is, if there's a system like that, do you see that might work better or worse if you were to, in terms of how much influence, like from the bottom up, in terms of holistically, you can address these issues versus just kind of narrowly addressing education when there's a lot of other things that have influence on whether kids succeed or fail in the systems.
All right, Dora, I'll let you start.
Okay, I think one of the benefits, or one of the alleged benefits of mayoral control, was that the mayor had different departments that could be deployed in different ways to be able to deal with the education issues. So that you would think that yes, indeed, you not only have the levers of education, but you also have the safety issues that are so important in some communities, or the housing issues that are so important in communities, so that you would have all of those instruments. Would those instruments would it be easier to get community participation and community voice if all of a sudden there was greater control by the state board? I think that was your question.
Yeah.
Part of it was more or less your question. You then have in the state board, you have 9 individuals, right, also elected. Each of them would have, so I think that there are pros, and I think that there are, in every system that you choose, the elected person has a political viewpoint, right? And so you have 9 politicians deciding on something, or you have 1 politician deciding on something. Depends on what you're dealing with. I think that in this particular case, in this issue of education, we need to hold the mayor accountable, as I said before. She has all the levers in order to be able to give an excellent education to all our students.
Actually, a follow-up. I actually meant blowing up a lot more than that. I mean, reconfiguring the entire state board of education, so part of it's not elected, part of it is. So,
Okay.
I mean, even so, with that in mind, you still, I'm not talking about using the same thing that's not working as well as we might know. If it would expand so you can change it, reconfigure it, but you still have an interest in.
So you mean like completely changing the whole system from what it is now?
Yes, the system was invented in 1 year by 2 people who are no longer with us. So maybe, we revisit what was created a long time ago that may have worked in some ways but not worked in others. So I'm saying, like, what if you just looked at the entire thing and revisited it? Not, whatever, in the context of what you can say.
In this, let me see, for a follow-up then, since you did use your 2 minutes, what I'm gonna say is I'll give you 1 extra minute to follow up, and then Ruth, I'll give you 3 minutes to respond. Fair?
Okay.
Okay.
I think that the main issue, the central issue for me, is how it is that you deal with growth. I think that all of the issues of the institutionality, of how you fix the boxes, of who controls the boxes, in my mind, is not the priority. The priority is to figure out how we can accommodate additional students and how we can deal with the overcrowding and the achievement gap. Those are my priorities, and I think that we are best use our energies towards that purpose. So I think that you can have all sorts of configurations, and I'm not sure which one will give you the best result, but I think we need to figure out how to work within what we have right now to solve those problems that I feel are a priority.
So, first of all, I think the goal is to have a functioning operation. That is the goal. And there's not necessarily one specific way you accomplish that. We are in a very odd place, right? We're the city, we're also a state, we have mayoral control, we have charters. It's, whatever we come up with that's gonna work is gonna be unique. But what I wanna say is, 10 years ago, when mayoral control was introduced, Phil Mendelson, the chair of the council, his view of it was, he didn't want to throw the schools into all this tumult. His idea was, who cares about the boxes? What matters is we need to make it get fixed, and he didn't want to put the schools into the tumult. Well, here we are. I think the way in which the boxes shifted didn't help very much, but I have no interest in throwing the schools back into the kind of tumultuous changes that large governance shifts would create. But I do think there are things that we can do. And two things that I have talked about, both of which are now moving through the council, thanks to Councilwoman Shea. One is to create an independent research operation. This isn't exactly governance, but it would mean there's a place in the city where data would get vetted, where data would not get spun, where data that was kind of unhappy would still get collected, where researchers could look and see what was going on. So that's one thing that I think would be super important, and it would help everything. The other thing that's important to say about OSSI and mayoral control is a lot of other cities have mayoral control. I mean, I don't know, 15, 18 cities probably now have mayoral control. Every single one of them is part of a state. So what it means is that this mayoral controlled district isn't just floating out there being controlled entirely by one person. It reports to, it's part of a state education agency, and there's a superintendent of the state education agency who is somehow democratically responsible, right? Either they're named by a governor, they're typically responsible to a state board of education. So there's a lot of ways you can do that, but for us, it's a huge problem that we have this, the mayor names the, sort of what you're saying, the mayor names the chancellor of DC Public Schools. The mayor also names the state superintendent who oversees that system. It was sort of, I think it was Plato, who guards the guardians, right? I mean, you can't have a system like that. It does not work. And I think we've seen it does not work. That's why we've gotten inflated graduation statistics. It's why DCPS fudged the numbers on suspension until, I think the Washington Post caught that one. I mean, we ought to have a little, we should have awards at the end of every year. Which scandal did which piece of media catch? Because we don't have anything internal to catch these things. So,
all the way in the back in the blue.
So obviously there's sort of limited capacity and a limited role the way the city is organized, but it's one of the things that is driving all of these different capacity numbers. They drive your enrollment, they drive which drives your budget. You sort of go back and you look at whether your child might or might not be able to get a seat in a particular school. It depends on the capacity and the enrollment and who's coming through. So within the sort of authorities of the job and looking at Ward 3, do you think there's something that the board as a whole could do to actually get those numbers out of DCPS? Because I think they do. I mean, as you know, I sit on the Chancellor's Working Group, and one of the big problems that we have is getting the actual capacity numbers that are appropriate for the schools, that the school actually agrees with, because that's the issue. And then you find something with a master facilities plan is using a different number. So it just seems to me that when you have a school system that isn't willing to put out the capacity numbers, or they put out a capacity number, and then a year later, even though there's been no construction or anything else, that capacity number goes up by 100. Like that changes your denominator, which then changes the percent, you know, over capacity your school is, overcrowding. It changes the attractiveness of that school to neighborhood families. It makes it potentially more attractive to the other boards, but that doesn't actually make any sense, because what you want to be doing is sort of, you know, a rising tide raises all boats. I don't know who said that. I'm pretty sure it wasn't Plato, but it might have been. But if you could get to the point where you knew where the capacity was, the actual capacity was, the numbers, you could start to see what is attracting parents in other wards to that school when there's no seat for those kids. Like, that's the thing. So there's no seats at Deal, there's no seats at Jandy, there's no seats at Lafayette, there's no seats, you can't even do your seniors at Wilson. So what can this particular job, in this particular job, can we do to encourage you to get to the bottom of those capacity numbers, and to have mandate and scope to do that?
And just so I'm clear, what was your name?
Sorry, my name is Carissa Kovner, and I'm the former HSA president at Merch, the current LSCT chair at Deal, and Chancellor's Working Group.
All right, well, Ruth, I'll let you take that question.
So I think
they're constantly changing, and they won't give it to you. We've asked them.
They count differently. Everybody counts slightly differently.
Well, they won't.
It's not just that they can't. There was just a meeting of so one of the other things there's so many things going on in education. If you want to keep track, you have to go to about 11 meetings a week, really. And one of them is the master's facilities plan, which is going to create this whole plan about where we need new buildings and where we have too much and how it's going to grow, blah blah blah. So, and one of the problems is that people do count differently. The charters count differently. Every charter counts differently from each other charter, and then they count differently from DCPS. And just to be clear, what Chris is talking about is you could have a school that, as you say, you know, yesterday it had a capacity of 460 people. So tomorrow, and we've seen this at a lot of schools, the kids who used to be in a classroom getting, say, special ed services, now they're behind the stage, right? So now you have an extra classroom. And these kids are being taken care of. So you have more capacity than you did. Or you put a bunch of trailers on and your capacity, this happened in Stoddard, you go from 400 to 500 overnight. And in fact, the new numbers that are being used in the master facilities plan for Stoddard show it at under 100% capacity. I think it shows it, if I'm remembering, at under 90%. Because if it was over 90%, it would be a triangle, and it was only a circle.
And they said it was because of the trailers.
Right. So anyway, just to clarify that, but to the point about can the state board do it? I think it's very hard for the state board to play a big role in that as a state board. I think there's two things. One, I do think that, and I have really tried to do this, that state board members can also be activists in their wards and have a bully pulpit, and we do have sort of more access to the council members. We do see the mayor at different places. We can raise these things. And I think it's really important for state board members to do that, even though it's a strictly Ward 3 issue. And again, as just a member, really as a member of the public, but with the kind of the bully pulpit of the state board, I participate in these master facilities plans meetings, and hopefully that will have an effect. And then part of what I also do, and we all do, is make sure everybody else knows about these meetings so we can all get there and all start making these cases.
Dora?
I think that the bully pulpit is critical, and I think that having people have more access to information and bringing awareness as to what the numbers are, what are the inconsistencies in the numbers, I think are absolutely critical. I think that the State Board of Education, if the one thing that they can do is to be the sort of bring that interaction with the community and bring stakeholders' views and make sure the data is consistent. To see, even though you may not have access to the kind of statistics that you want or secondary sources, you have access to people who are in the schools, you have access to that kind of secondary ground information that is so critical in providing feedback in these meetings. And it is all about providing feedback in these meetings and correcting the information. So I think that is direct authority to say that you must do this or you must do that or you must change your process. No, but I think, as Ruth mentioned, this issue of the bully pulpit and bringing the community perspectives into it and the data into it, I think, are key.
Can I say one more thing on this?
It wouldn't be fair. Sorry. So we don't have too much time left, but what I want to do is get the last few questions in, so make sure your questions are the ones you want to hear last, if you want, last few at least. And so, yes, in the...
Matthew Fruman, Janie Deal and Wilson grads, and now alumnus of DC Tech, completely with all the kids going through. One of the issues in the city is mobility. And it goes to some of the things that both of you have been talking about achievement gap and the difference between the charter schools and the DCPS schools and the common report card that we're going to be coming up with. Because systematically what happens is that charter schools lose thousands of children in the middle of the year, and DCPS schools everywhere, but very heavily in the lowest income communities, gain thousands of children during the course of the year and see children moving around inside of them. So you have a lot of mobility inside of DCPS, particularly in low-income schools. And that's because they play this matter of right role, and so that's a thing that fits in. But the challenges associated with that are enormous in terms of addressing the achievement gap. I mean, totally enormous. Every study shows how bad this is for the kids who move and for the schools they go to. And so the question is, what would you try to do about mobility? And how does it fit into how you see the two sectors? Because I'm not sure that we have two sectors that are operating on the same rules. And what does it mean in terms of how we evaluate a school? One that is losing students and another that is gaining students in the middle of the year. So that's my question. Mobility, what does it mean on all of those fronts?
Dora, I'll let you start this one.
Okay. it is the perception that, and I've heard, I haven't seen I want to say perception because I have not seen data. I have not seen the data to corroborate this, but it is true that charters have, the view is that they have stricter disciplinary measures, and so that after the famous moment where enrollment is audited and you then get your budget according to your enrollment, that then all of a sudden you see the mobility come into play and that there is a movement out of some charters and into the DCPS schools, because the DCPS schools, of course, cannot reject anyone, right? They have to take them in. And so there is this churning, and however, the money that was allotted stays with the charter school. So I think that there is that right there, if that is proven by the data, if the numbers do bear that out, then it would seem that you need to sort of review how many times a year you're doing this, you're doing this confirmation to pass monies on, because indeed it would not be fair if the money stayed with the charter and yet the responsible entity is a DPS school that doesn't have the money, but that has to deal with a student that obviously has some special or higher needs than you would think. So is that your mobility question? I didn't,
Well, the second piece is how does it fit in terms of looking at the two in comparison?
and I think that the student report card is a way of bringing both systems under the same metrics and beginning the conversation about how each of them reacts, how each of them deals with students in a more comparable way. I think it's the beginning of the conversation and setting more uniform rules.
Well, it's a huge problem. It's bad for the kids doing all the transit. It's not helpful to their education. Part of what happens for our own schools, as you said, in Ward 3 schools and DC public schools everywhere, you get all these students, and they don't have the funding to staff it because they don't get more staff when suddenly there's all these additional students. And then as we discovered at Wilson, then the next year you run into the same thing, and you have too few students at the beginning of the year and then too many at the end, and your budgets are already off. So that's a big issue. I want to raise something about, and by the way, it's not just about behavior. It's not just that charters push kids out because of behavior reasons. It's also at the really highly academic charters like BASIS, where some kids from here go to. Washington Latin. BASIS, I think, is known for most of all, Thurgood Marshall. Kids are, who can't keep up, are encouraged to leave. And at BASIS, I mean, everybody understands this, it's not new, is if you don't score well enough on their tests, you have to repeat a grade. And most families aren't gonna say repeat a grade, so they pull their kid out. And that's totally legal, and it happens. So we do need different rules to handle this. But I want to say something about the report card, because this report card is going to hit in December. Get ready for it. It's going to be the first time we have sort of this citywide report card. It's going to be, as Dora has said, same metrics for both sets of schools. The problem is the metrics are a problem. And I'll tell you in particular, there's a number of problems with it, but one that I will focus on is the main part of the rating is how many kids in your school reached a proficient threshold. And the proficient threshold is pretty high. How many kids reached it? It doesn't tell you at all for the high schools, and only some part for the elementary schools, how much did you grow, right? So in a low-income neighborhood, kids come in here. They don't come in here. What? Oh, time? Yeah. Okay. Well, we can come back to that. But
and so since we're talking about the 5-star rating and everything, I'll just go ahead and ask a question following on that, because that's something that you, as the State Board of Education, do have power to approve and talk about. So let's follow up on that and say, I'm curious, should schools have 5-star ratings? Why or why not? Ruth, I'll let you start with that.
So I think it is a great idea for schools to have an apples-to-apples comparison. We are a city of choice. That's not going away. People want to be able to compare across sectors and across schools what's going on. So I think that's a good idea. But how you do the comparisons is super important. You need to compare in ways that are meaningful to parents and that are fair and that are accurate and that incentivize good educational practice. And I would say on all counts, this report card is not as good as it should be. And I really hope that we're gonna improve it, and that's really a priority of mine on the board in the next round. As I said, most of the test score weight is on proficiency. All of it is on proficiency at the high school. So you could have a high school, just to say, where the kids come in like this, you know, at a Ballou, and man, they could get to there. It could be an incredible school. I don't think that's what's going on right now, but it could. And those schools would get no credit on that report card for that enormous growth because they wouldn't hit the threshold. It's very, very biased against schools with low-income kids because, as I think most people know, test scores are very, very correlated to income. Growth scores less so, so that would be better. In addition, part of what a number of us pushed for in terms of the report cards was to include test score growth, but also to include measures like the breadth of the curriculum, right? I mean, I think schools that really offer kids a full menu of social studies, science, and arts, that's really important. That should boost them in this report card. If they push all of that out to focus on reading and math so that the test scores are higher, which actually they won't be, but people think they will be, they shouldn't get extra points for that. Also, school climate surveys was a way to try to, there are ways of sort of surveying parents, kids, and faculty to get a sense of whether or not the school is doing the kinds of things that are going to lead to good achievement. And we should include that as well.
Dora, 5-star ratings.
Okay, I think that we're on the same path because I think that it is a good first start. It is by no means a perfect one, but there are the intention is that you are going to be reviewing these measures and you are going to be including more growth measures, and that they're going to have a bigger weight and hopefully a weight that is over 40%. Because at least when you look at some of the studies that have come out, more and more states are moving into weighting growth and weighting them at least between 33 and 50% of the weight, because they want to get away from this correlation with poverty, so that all you're doing with the test, the achievement scores, are just picking sort of income measures. So I think that this is a first step. It is a step that needs to. It is there are a set of indicators that need to be reviewed. There is a pilot on climate, school climate, which is incredibly important. There's also an attempt to include issues of access, so that if you have, for example, the kind of additional offerings that you may have in terms of other enriched curriculum, if you have AP, if there are AP courses, IB, International Baccalaureate, all of these elements are being incorporated. So I think that the idea is to improve it and to not just make it a set of scores that reflect only achievement levels and therefore only are picking up income differentials. So it's a start and it needs to be improved, but I think that that's in the cards.
Any other questions?
Yes, please introduce yourself.
So I'm not from Ward 3. Is that okay?
Okay. It depends what you ask.
So I'm from Ward 2. I'm an adult literacy teacher and I work with libraries. I happen to follow the education town halls that Committee Chairman Grosso held this summer across the city with high school students. I found that to be completely depressing. The saddest thing I've ever seen. It's unbelievable. Children from good schools, so it was horrible. And the chancellor's sessions, on the other hand, everyone seemed pretty much on the same page with a set of solutions and things that they wanted to see in the chancellor. So it seems to be a big disconnect for me, not having been involved with teaching children in this city. But I am also a community organizer, and a government that will not give you the numbers for whatever it is they're trying to do, the data, is either incompetent, which this government is not,
or they're dishonest, which is what I would say this government is. And so, to candidates, I would say, are you willing to go down and sit in the mayor's office or in the office of planning and say, we demand these numbers, they belong to us, the public, and we'll be here until you can give them to us or give us a date by which they will be given to us, because you cannot plan without the numbers, and the city is right now involved in rewriting or amending the comprehensive plan. And so the education plan must fit within this, and we need the numbers to deal with that. That my question. Is that?
Ruth, I'll let you start.
Well,
Because I'll go with you.
I might go with you to a sit-in. We'd have to, well, if we all go, I'm in. And it may be necessary. But I want to make the broader point, which is, because there was some sense that, well, there was this master facilities plan meeting, and the result of which is we've all raised these issues, and now it's all going to get fixed because people are going to go back and fix it. I'm not nearly so confident about that, because I've seen this. There are I don't know the reasons, but they don't want to put out accurate capacity numbers. It's the same thing. There has been a refusal to put out accurate school turnover numbers. And I could go on down the list. And I want to go back to the question that was over there, because we do need to figure out how, whether we have a sit-in or not, we got to figure out an institutional way to make sure that accurate data is available to people. And I think we have sort of two things that are sort of working their way through the council that have the potential to do that. One is this research entity we've talked about, and the other is to put at least parts of OSSE under somebody other than the mayor. It could be the council, it could be the board, it could be some hybrid. And it doesn't have to be all the programs, because some of the programs are part of what is supposed to work in mayoral control, right? That you want the mayor in charge of the schools and the, you know, some of the after-school activities and some of the healthcare activities. So you don't have to mess with that, but we need to mess with the way in which the data is handled. And hopefully, maybe we'll all go down to the council and talk about it, because it's going to be working its way through this fall.
I think on this issue of data, I think it brings up the importance of academic research, and it brings the importance of having more the data sets that are available for people in various parts, right? And not just certain schools or certain institutions, but to have access to the data to begin to analyze it. And I think that when you get various types of people looking at that data and massaging it and doing statistical analysis on it, that's when you really pick up the inconsistencies. I think you're always going to have inconsistencies in data. You're always going to have an element of error. And the more open it is and the more available it is, then you can pick up the inconsistencies. I think you can also do, as the board has been doing and as the council has been doing, you can ask the auditor to go in and to do further research on that, and indeed that is the function of auditors. The function of auditors, external auditors, is to come in and to verify data integrity. You also have internal audit, and that is the essence, the idea of OSSE, to have a sort of internal audit to see whether the data that is being provided is also good. So you have both internal controls and you have external controls, but then you need to also have this great openness so that other people can come in and show you where your inconsistencies in your data are and how it is that you can improve those. So all for independent research.
Do we have any other questions from audience members? All right, well, I will ask a few more questions because we have a little bit of time. Kind of thinking about, so the school board recently commissioned this research report on teacher turnover, and I'm curious for you all are running for school board members, what other things can the school board actually look into? What other topics are priorities for you all, thinking about what do you want to look into? What do you think the public wants to know about?
I think that a key issue, in addition to teacher turnover and related to teacher turnover, are the issues of school climate, for example. I think there are a large set of issues that have to do with how it is that you design those kinds of surveys, how it is that you can diagnose whether your school culture and your school environment is conducive not only to teachers but also to students. So I think that kind of work merits some discussion and some further analysis. And those are issues that are all tied, in my mind, to the STAR rating system. So how it is that we can improve and ensure that the STAR system is looking at all schools in the district and that they are comparing them and doing the best job possible to give us a sense of what's going, what are the qualities, are they doing a good job, or do they need to be improved? Because it's that discussion with parents and with and the benchmarking that will help us to improve the educational quality that those schools can provide.
So when you say school climate, what specific things are you looking at?
School climate, a climate of trust. It could be issues that have to do with the suspensions, whether the suspensions, what is the sort of the distributional impact of suspensions? Are they falling on certain groups? Looking at whether the teachers and the students feel supported. There are all sorts of surveys that ask you, do you feel safe? A little bit more sophisticated language that I'm using right now in the way I'm posing the question. But I think that there are a number of ways that we have looked at, particularly now that we have moved into all of this efforts in social emotional learning, that tell us how it is that we can identify potential problems in the school climate and the school culture.
And Ruth, same question.
So let me say the State Board of Ed, this is the first big report that it's done, or at least the first big report in my 4 years, this report on teacher turnover, which grew out of some hearings that we had with teachers about this problem. We'd all been hearing about it. It's a very straightforward report. It is literally, somebody had to go into the records that get submitted to the city council during budget hearings and go into them and figure out year by year over like the past 5 to 10 years which teacher moved where and which teachers were still there. It was very tedious, and we were able to do it, and that's why we have these teacher turnover numbers. The next thing that needs to be done on teacher turnover before we even move to other subjects is, now we know that we have extraordinarily high levels of teacher turnover in our high poverty schools. For those who haven't read it yet, it's 30% plus on average, meaning some years it's 40% of the teachers leave every year. How can you possibly teach? How can you learn? Why? Why is this? What do we need to do to address this? So that's the next issue. And let me say, I think we can do some of that. I think the state board is positioned maybe to do some survey research on that we can commission out. But I actually think the real research on that actually does need to be more academic research. It really does need to be people who know how to research, who know how to go into schools and really look and see what's going on. And that probably isn't in our purview, but I'm hopeful that it could be one of the early projects of this new independent research consortium. Another issue that I would love to see the board do, something that I've talked about, I know it's an issue here, is this issue about curriculum breadth. I mean, to what extent, and sort of an excess testing, to what extent, there's a lot of complaints, I get a lot of complaints about too much testing. Well, how much is it? How much is too much? We don't have the data to look at and have a reasonable conversation on. I'm totally for an end of the year test. Maybe even in more subjects, frankly. We want to know where our kids are. But that shouldn't mean that you're doing test prep and that you're doing test practice and you've got homework tests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not the same at every school, but how much is there? And to what extent is it really interfering with schooling? We need to know so that we can do something about it. And along with that is the extent to which the focus and the pressure to do well on the reading and math tests pushes out the social studies and the science and the arts.
All right, I have time for one more question for really someone who hasn't had a chance to ask, want to ask? Okay, if not, then I saw your hand first, so I will.
So we haven't talked much tonight about professional development, and it is part of why teachers leave. Teachers don't leave as much for money. If they did, they'd all be going to law school and medical school, and that's not where they go when they leave. So what is your sense of the state of professional development right now in the district, and what would you do to improve it?
Me first. So, this is an issue, let me say again, we can use the bully pulpit on professional development. We don't have any authority over professional development. It comes strictly from DCPS and from each individual charter. What I can say about DCPS, it's sort of a plus and a minus. They take professional development very seriously. They put a lot of effort into it. They put a lot of resources into it. And they have a really good idea about it based on the policy research that I know about, which is what you want to do with professional development is help teachers in their content area. So if you're a math teacher, you want to help people teach math to the kids that they're teaching. If it's social studies, that's what you want to help people teach. So DCPS put into place a couple of years ago the LEAP program, which is on paper an excellent professional development program that has all those characteristics. The problem is, and it's a DCPS problem, and there's so much I love about DCPS, and I'm sorry that I have to say these things, but it was put into place in a way, as we were talking about, somebody raised, it's an initiative, it's done. We're gonna have LEAP, and it was literally, I think not, other people here will know the details, I think it was 90 minutes a week for every teacher, they had to get it no matter what they already knew, no matter how experienced or talented they already were, and it was gonna be taught by a coach, and that coach had to be full-time, and it had to come out of your existing budget. So I know that there were schools, I think Eaton was a school where the school actually had to get rid of its reading teacher in order to provide the professional development in the formula that was required, even though most of the teachers in that school were really good teachers. So that's a problem. And so what I would say is it should be an issue that we deal with on the bully pulpit, but it's a very long list. And probably that is one that I would say we have less ability to do a lot about. Dora?
I think that Ruth brings up the issue of a little bit greater autonomy for schools, right? In defining exactly what their priorities are and where it is that their professional development could make the best use. Because I think it is true that there's a lot of excellent work in terms of professional development, but you need to figure out what it is that you need and what it is that are your priorities at your school. So that's why also I focus more on the issue of allowing school leaders to determine, to have greater flexibility in terms of their programs.
Okay, so right now we're going to have time for closing statements. So Dora, you will each, and Ruth, you will each have 3 minutes to close your closing statement, 2 minutes actually for closing statements. And just remember, I mean, you've talked about a lot of issues, a lot of you have agreed on a lot of issues, but also there are some issues where you do have discrepancies on how you view things, particularly around mayor control of schools or the structure of it and the structure of accountability, etc. within the district. So kind of think about those 2 things and also the things that you agree on and expound upon that. So yes, Dora, I'll let you start with your 2 minutes.
Okay. I think that we both agree on the importance of independent research. And I think how you insert independent research into the system, I think is important. I think that the proposals that suggest that the research should be incorporated in the auditor's office, I think are a little bit, I certainly don't agree with that particular placement. I think audit and research are different. They have different functions, and I think research looks at a set of broader issues. It looks at the socioeconomic impacts, the distributional impacts of your education policy, whereas the audit is looking for compliance. So I would put them in very, very separate categories. And I think that it should, as I mentioned before, it should be as open as possible so that we can get at data inconsistencies, we can get at data integrity, as well as pointing out what is it that works in our schools and where is it that we could improve them. Because I do think that we need a lot more evaluation of what we're doing. So on the independent research, that would be my first point. I still think that in terms of moving forward, we cannot move forward on all agenda items. I don't think that there's just enough political space or there's enough attention space to deal with many issues. So I think I reiterate my priorities, and that is that I think we need to focus with all the strength possible in terms of the master facilities plan and the planning for future growth. I think that is where our greatest opportunities lies in terms of beginning to deal with overcrowding, beginning to make a dent on the achievement gap. I think we need to be more uniform in creating in this space. We also need to have more uniform rules for both the charters and for DCPS. And I think we've made some inroads in that area.
And Ruth, those are remarks.
So let me take up one kind of wonky technical point around the research centers. In DC, the auditor's office, it's not like an auditor. In DC, we're a state, we're a city, the auditor is like the GAO. It is the organization within the government where you have independence from the mayor and you're able to take on large research projects. And so when I raised this issue of we need to set up an independent research entity. A few years ago, I had a piece in the Post, and with the scandals, it really took off as an idea. And the people who know how the city government works better than me thought this is the right place to put it, in the auditor's office. So again, don't be too turned off by that name auditor. Think of it more as a GAO. The main opposition to putting it in the auditor's office is from the mayor's office, because the mayor's office fears that they won't have sufficient control over it. And so the proposal from the mayor is, quote, to have it at an independent academic center. But the rules that have been revealed about that is that the mayor would have the right to veto any research project that they wanted to veto. So that's exactly why those of us who are in favor of this project feel like it is very important to put it in the auditor's office, where there is a tradition and a history of independence and the ability to sort of convene excellent researchers from all of our great universities, from all of our great think tanks. And the idea is that a really good program of research could incubate there, is sort of the word, and then in 2, 3, 4 years, as it becomes clear where's the talent, where's the dedication, where's the interest, it could get pushed out to one or more universities and work as a consortium. I think I've used up most of my time on that, but let me just say, I think, locally here in Ward 3, dealing with the crowding issue is just huge. I would like to think that working through the master facilities plan will help us with that. We're about to get a report from DCPS. Keep your eyes open. It's going to come out soon, and it's going to have some good ideas, and it's going to acknowledge for the first time.
The library will be closing in 30 minutes. No library cards will be issued in 15 minutes. Public computers will stop in 20 minutes. Restroom will close in 25 minutes. Thank you.
Should I take that as
Anyway, in all fairness, it was time. So thank you all for joining us. I think Brian, who wanted to close? We wanted to close and give you all, and if you still have questions for the candidates, I think they can stay. I think they're going to be around until they kick them out.
And the other thing, Jen, can I just say, I think both of us have literature on the side table and the back table, and I put out a regular newsletter on education. If you're not on it, sign up and I'll put you on it.
So we just wanted to thank all of you for coming out tonight, and thank Ruth and Dora for sharing your views with us, and Jenny for moderating, and invite you to join us for our next meeting, which is November 13th at the Georgetown Library, where we'll be hearing about mental health and social emotional learning in DC Public Schools this year. So thank you all so much for coming.